Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by journalist and author of the Proximities Substack, Barry Malone. Barry, thanks for coming on tonight. It's a bit of a difficult show, a lot of heavy stuff to get through.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm okay. And it's really nice to be on with you for the first time.
Coming up tonight, 2 years on from October 7th, we'll look at how the world has changed. And some forewarning here, as I said above, it's a heavy show, as we'll go over the timeline of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. We'll also discuss the impact of Israel's genocide on how we're governed here at home. Plus, Barry Malone explains why a Gen Z protest movement in Madagascar is taking on their government. And for some light relief, and it'll be much needed, Tory Conference is going very badly. So we'll show you some clips from that at the end of the show. Stay tuned for all of that and more. And if you'd like to support our work, and we'd love it if you would support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Today marks 2 years since Hamas fighters broke out of Gaza and attacked military installations, kibbutzim, and a music festival in Israel. That means it has also been 2 years since Israel launched an assault on the enclave, one that quickly turned into an operation of unmatched slaughter, rampant destruction, and unconstrained barbarity. A genocide, in short, one that has only intensified over the last 24 months and that has left the future of Palestine and Palestinians in great peril. On October the 7th, 2023, in an incursion that lasted several hours, around 4,000 armed fighters from Hamas and other groups, along with some 2,000 civilians, took part in what was called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. At 6:30 a.m., some reached the Nova Music Festival, where young Israelis had been partying over a holiday weekend. That soon turned into a bloodbath when fighters using motorbikes, trucks, and paragliders descended on the crowds, firing indiscriminately and taking hostages. At the same time, Hamas fighters reached a number of kibbutzim where further massacres were committed and hostages taken, with dozens of homes burned down. Once the IDF responded, there were further killings of Israelis, with Israeli media later reporting the widespread deployment of the so-called Hannibal Directive, with soldiers ordered to stop the vehicles of fighters returning to Gaza at all costs, no matter whether they contained Israeli hostages. Tanks and helicopters fired reportedly burned out around 70 cars along roads leading to Gaza, leading to the killing of up to 27 Israeli hostages, according to some estimates. Hamas and other groups, without a doubt, committed a number of atrocities that day, war crimes of almost every kind, including killing and targeting civilians and taking hostages. Just over 800 Israeli civilians, along with 400 members of the Israeli security forces, were killed, while some 250 civilian and soldier captives were taken to Gaza. But October 7th, of course, also marks the day that Israel responded to those crimes by carrying out, over the course of 2 years, war crimes that have not previously been recorded in recent history, responding to a day of horrific violence with an avalanche of unbound sadism. In 2 years, at least 67,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed by Israeli bullets and drones, US-sponsored bombs, and F-35 fighter jets held in the sky by British parts. Swathes of the Strip have been flattened and vital civilian infrastructure destroyed, from hospitals to schools and from sewage treatment plants to high-rise buildings. Gaza's medics have been arrested, tortured and killed, while the enclave's journalists have been systematically eliminated. Children have also been particularly targeted, with Israel's military snipering some as young as toddlers in their heads, chest and abdomens. Gaza's inhabitants have endured disease, anesthesialess amputations, tents set aflame and their occupants with them, all while entire families are wiped out. And starvation has been repeatedly used as a weapon of war, turning a population against its own survival instincts as they've risked execution for basic sustenance. Millions of people have been displaced, often several times over, trawling from the north of the Strip to the south, then back again, killed by bomb, bullet and building collapse as they go, whether they're in safe zones or not. There remains no safe place in Gaza. New terms have had to be invented to describe the unabashed violence rained down on that population. Wounded child, no surviving family. After wounded child, no surviving family. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been injured, tens of thousands in permanently life-altering ways. Gaza is all but gone. War crime? What's a war crime? Genocide, civilian, mass murder, crimes against humanity. For 2 years, that's just been any given Tuesday on your iPhone. On Al Jazeera today, 3 Palestinians in Gaza reflected on the 24 months that have passed since October 7th, 2023.
It's a Nakba with death, destruction, hunger and displacement. Our families have died. Our homes are gone. We pray to God that this war will end as soon as possible.
These 2 years of war felt like 20 years of tragedies, suffering, displacement, homelessness, with the famine that we've been living through, but also and the lack of stability and constant displacements.
2 years of war have meant the end of our future, our homes, our families, the loss of loved ones, a psychological strain, exhaustion, many injuries, body parts in shreds, the inability to help others due to the severe shortage of human and medical resources.
Of course, October 7th is now an important day of mourning in Israel. Here, mourners visit the site of the Nova Festival, where they moved among rows of posts erected to hold photographs of the victims. The Israeli flag was flown at half-mast, while the names of the dead began to be read out at exactly 6:29 a.m. That was the time at which Hamas entered the Nova Festival. We can only imagine the fields and fields required for such posts to be erected to the Palestinians killed by Israel in the last 2 years, or the days or even weeks it would take to read out all of their names. Of course, none of that is likely ever to happen for them. Barry, it's been 2 years since this momentous event rocked the world, 2 years of Israeli assault on the Strip. Since then, what are your reflections on this day, on this anniversary of the unfolding of all of this?
It's terrible to, although we see it every day on our phones, it's terrible to see it all lined up together in that piece that you have just done, and to remember the utter barbarity that Palestinians have been experiencing from that day and to this day in a campaign of genocide and ethnic extermination. I mean, I think that it's a very heavy day, and it's a heavy day for a lot of people. And as you said, there are events in Israel to mark the attack that happened there. Also, I think we should acknowledge that there are people in Israel who do not seek to weaponize what happened on October 7th to justify the genocide against the Palestinian people. And indeed, some of those people are actually families who lost people on October 7th. So, you know, they deserve to have their day of mourning. But of course, it's also a day of mourning and reflection for the Palestinian people and the many, many millions of people all over the world who support them and want to see an end to this genocide. But it's not just a day in which I think people who want the genocide to end are going to reflect and mourn, but I think that they also want to express their fury, you know, their fury that this is continuing, their fury that Western governments are sponsoring it, and their fury that every single day we see scores of people killed in Gaza. And it's mind-boggling in a way to think that this has gone on for 2 years. So I also sort of thought this morning, you know, well, look, where are we? And, you know, as we speak, we have the negotiations between Hamas officials and Israeli officials, along with mediators, going on in Cairo to discuss Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan. I think, and I'm sure a lot of people agree, that there are massive problems with that peace plan. Not least the fact that I believe it demands that Palestinian people accept their own subjugation. It effectively calls resisting occupation an act of radicalism. But you also get the sense from listening to some people in Gaza and talking to some people in Gaza that they just want some respite, that they just want the violence to end. And so from that perspective, I do hope that something will come out of these talks that can then perhaps be built upon by the Palestinian people. Trump has all along sought to say that the talks are going really well. There's an interesting little story from Reuters today in which Qatar, which, as we know, has been a mediator for most of the last 2 years, said actually that there's a lot more work to do. And I believe the Qatari official who spoke to Reuters said that every single point in the 20-point plan will need ironing out in terms of how to ensure that, you know, it can be practically applied on the ground in Gaza. So yeah, a very, very heavy day. I think reflection, mourning, and also justifiable fury. And let's hope that something comes out of these talks in Cairo.
My own concern is that actually I think this is a sort of pattern that we've seen before when it comes to Gaza or Palestine more generally, where there is some kind of extended assault by Israel of various forms, often in response to various kinds of acts of resistance on the part of Palestinians, and then a ceasefire is sort of arranged once as Israelis sometimes say, that the lawn has been mown. A ceasefire is put into place, one that Palestinians exhausted, etc., accept, only for the sense of, I guess, injustice to rebuild, and therefore then there to be a further act of some kind of resistance, if you want to call it that. And then the accusation is then that the Palestinians have breached the ceasefire. So you always get this kind of framing of whatever happens as the Palestinians having breached the ceasefire. And indeed, we saw how the media reported October 7th as though it was the beginning of something, rather than simply yet another chapter in a really long history. So in that way, a ceasefire can look like a kind of trap for the Palestinians. I mean, it sounds like you don't agree with that, though.
No. I do agree with that. I mean, I'm hopeful, especially when you listen to people in Gaza, that they want, as you say, they're exhausted and they want some kind of ceasefire, of some kind of an end to the current wave of carnage that they're experiencing. They don't want their children to be killed anymore. They don't want to see children especially, starving to death. I think we're up to nearly 500 people who've starved to death so far. But I think that everything that you say is true, and it could again play out that way. And look, when you project forward and you listen to what people are saying about the future, those plans, as certainly as mooted by countries like the US, are absurd. They're talking about installing Tony Blair as an effective, viceroy over Gaza. And yes, we could repeat the same pattern again. And I'm not, again, while I hope that there's some kind of a short-term or medium-term end to the violence that we're seeing right now, to the genocide that we're seeing right now, there does need to be a better map going forward. And it's really depressing to say that it's very hard to see that happening in the short term. And I don't trust the Israeli government, and I don't trust Netanyahu. And I think that we've seen a lot of reporting that shows that it's the Israeli government who has pulled down these negotiations in the past. We've seen that Netanyahu speaks completely differently when he speaks in Hebrew to an Israeli audience than when he speaks in English to a Western audience, or when he's on Fox News, etc. But it's always framed as if it's Hamas who are unwilling to agree to peace. So look, I think that all of the things that you say are at play, but I can't but kind of hope that there's just some kind of respite,
The Palestinians, I don't know, it says something about international deal making, that it can count as a sort of deal when you've beaten a population into enormous submission through 2 years worth of egregious, inhumane assault amounting to genocide. But let me ask you about the future of Israel, because we always talk about the future of Palestinian, like, what will happen with the Palestinians? What's the status of Palestine? What do you think the status of Israel is after all of this? Do you think Israel is going to come out of this completely unscathed?
Yeah, kind of. Obviously there are internal sort of machinations in Israel, but, sadly, I think the truth of what we've seen in the last 2 years is that, you'll see sometimes kind of Western pundits saying Netanyahu is the problem, or, we need to get rid of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a far right president, or they'll talk about, Ben Gvir, or, but the truth is that the genocide has been incredibly well supported in Israel by almost every facet of Israeli society. And I think opinion poll after opinion poll has shown that. And while there have been some protests in Israel, and, respect to the people who have engaged with them, because it's not an easy thing to do as an Israeli, they've been ultimately very, very small. And I think we have to kind of confront that this act of horror that's been perpetrated against the genocide people is popular in Israel and speaks to a kind of a fundamental problem in Israeli society and the sort of the political discourse that happens there. And the other thing about, will this have a negative impact on Israel? Israel is just operating with utter impunity right now. We've seen it, not only what it's doing in Gaza, but the fact that it's attacked almost every country in the region with impunity. The fact that it dropped incendiary bombs on a humanitarian flotilla. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. They've tested this for 2 years and they've realized that they can do whatever they want. So, to try and think about whether or not there's going to be any negative impact, it's really difficult right now because who is going to hold them to account? We've also seen that international law has been proven to be an utter joke over the last 2 years. So, I would like to say that there would be some kind of ramification or censure, and maybe it will happen at some point far in the future, but right now I don't see it.
Let's go on to the wider region. Since October the 7th, it isn't just Palestine that's been targeted by Israel. The Israeli military has launched several attacks on neighboring or nearby countries, some of which were operating against Israel in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, but others that weren't. In September, Israel attacked 6 countries in a single 72-hour window. This was the moment Israel bombed Qatar's capital, Doha, on the 9th of September.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Sana hindi pumami yung kotse. Oh my God!
That attack on the sovereign territory targeted a number of Hamas leaders, apparently meeting to discuss a ceasefire deal. The strike killed 6 people, including the son of a senior Hamas leader and a Qatari security officer, but none of the Hamas officials. That same day, Israel struck Lebanon, killing 5 people, and Syria, where an Air Force base and military barracks were hit. The next day, Israel also attacked Yemen's capital Sana'a, targeting Houthi positions. And that strike took place just 2 weeks after Israel assassinated the country's de facto Prime Minister, Ahmed al-Rahawi, and several government officials. And just off the coast of Tunisia, this happened on 2 consecutive nights in the same period. Those were the impacts of incendiary devices dropped from drones onto 2 boats in the Summit Global Flotilla. As you'll know, they were intercepted in international waters last week, where Israel abducted nearly 450 participants, holding them in a prison renowned for torture and mistreatment in the Negev desert, before releasing many of them this past weekend. And of course, Gaza was relentlessly bombed throughout. But compared to the last 2 years, these attacks on sovereign countries were on the small side, as far as Israel is concerned. In September last year, a wave of exploding pagers killed 32 people and injured around 3,500 others across Lebanon, the result of a lengthy intelligence plot by Israel to weaken Hezbollah. That followed an earlier attack in Lebanon's capital, Beirut, in July that year, one that assassinated Hezbollah commander Fuad Shakur. But that explosion alone, one of a wave of strikes on Beirut, killed a mother and 2 children and injured 74 people. That was quickly followed by the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, where he was attending the inauguration of Iran's new president. That political killing on Iranian soil led to a fairly orchestrated volley of strikes and counterstrikes between the 2 countries last year. But it wasn't until this year that war between the 2 countries, Israel and Iran, seemed almost inevitable. In June, Israel launched a full-scale attack on Iran, seeking to assassinate military leaders and scientists while disabling the country's nuclear sites. In Tehran, targets ranged from individual cars to residential blocks. But it was Iran's nuclear sites that were the real target, with Israel launching several volleys of missiles against them. Israel also struck Iranian state TV.
آنچه که ملاحظه کردید، صدایی که شنیدید، فضای غبارآلوده استادیوم.
That war with Iran culminated with this.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
An extraordinary series of events in the region, Barry, one that amazingly hasn't led to all-out war with another state. How do you think that's been avoided, given Israel attacking 6 countries in a 72-hour period just last month?
Yeah, it's crazy. Again, when you see it all lined up like that, it's remarkable that one country could attack so many other countries in such a short space of time. I mean, have you ever seen this before? I can't seem to recall any similar period in modern history where one country has attacked so many other countries in the region. I think that, unfortunately, the attacks have been pretty effective. And I think that they have debilitated the ability of a lot of other armed actors in the region to respond. I say unfortunately because if Israel sees that these kinds of attacks are effective, then we can only imagine that it's going to continue to launch them. And that is very worrying for the region. We don't know where that might go in the future. But also, if you look at the list of, I'd almost not forgotten, but the pager attacks seem so long ago when so many other Israeli attacks have happened since. And the pager attacks, I think, were one of the most despicable attacks outside of Gaza that Israel has launched, lauded in Western media and called stunning and innovative and creative. But really completely indiscriminate. Because, the men who are carrying those pagers, the men and women who are carrying those pagers were out shopping. They were having dinner with their families when they had those pagers on them. It's a completely indiscriminate act of violence. But when I look at all those countries who it's attacked, Iran, we've seen them bomb over the years. Syria, we've seen them bomb over the years. I mean, that's been going on for quite a long time. I think the one that was most striking was the attack on Qatar. And I think that the attack on Doha against the Hamas negotiators was hugely shocking to a lot of people, including very experienced people who work in the region or report on the region. I think I said on this show before that, I lived in Qatar as a journalist for almost 5 years. I still have contacts there. And, there was a lot of talk after the strike happened that the Qataris somehow assented to it, that the Qataris somehow knew about it. I mean, I think that's complete nonsense. They did not know about it. And if they had got wind of it, they would have tried everything that they possibly could do to stop it. And I think that behind the scenes, although, they spoke very diplomatically, they were absolutely furious. And why that one was so significant was because Qatar is a key US ally, and it really is a key US ally for many, many reasons. And it has a US military base on its territory. So when you talk about getting security guarantees from the US, what better security guarantee could you imagine having than a US military base on your territory? And yet Israel still bombs your capital city. So for me, when the Qatar strike happened, I realized there really is no red line. There really is total impunity. And the US really will allow Israel to do whatever it wants. So again, I keep talking about impunity, but that's what we're seeing. Again, it's just unprecedented that a country can attack that many neighbors and there is absolutely no consequences.
One of the things that you talked about at the top of the show was the collapse of international law, in a sense, the collapse of a kind of international order. Even if you didn't necessarily believe it was all it's cracked up to be, still it's something that's gone. And when you were talking about the unprecedented nature of the attack on six states or six territories in 72 hours, the idea that Israel becomes emboldened by the fact that it's got away with it. So, it has a strategy now where, it could just wipe out the militaries or the military capacity of other countries or other armed groups on other territories and get away with it. But the thing is that, there must be other states looking on thinking, well, why can't I get away with that too? Arguments in the West about how this is a war crime or this is, anti-international law just aren't going to hold anymore. And if I'm a state that has a backer which is as big as or nearly as big as or close to the US, but opposed to them politically, then I also have impunity. Do you think we're likely to see that kind of spiraling out of this sort of new political reality to other actors around the world?
Yep, 100%. I agree with you that I don't think international law has fully existed for everybody in the world. International law has not really been wielded against Western powers in any significant way and has often been used as a cudgel against Western enemies, even for a very long time, up until quite recently. The International Criminal Court had only prosecuted people or issued arrest warrants for people from the African continent. So, you can argue whether it effectively existed at all. It certainly wasn't applied evenly, but I think that, the last 2 years has shown us that it's dead as a dodo. And I think that the genocide in Gaza has changed things forever because it's shown that no rules apply anymore. And Gaza and Palestine is often called the kind of laboratory of warfare. This is where Israel, it's a testing ground for the weapons that they then go and sell around the world to other governments, often authoritarian governments. And yes, I think that there will be other countries around the world who will see that they can crack down, whether that's on, dissent at home or whether that's in some kind of a territorial or border dispute, and maybe surmise that if they remain close to Western powers or a country like the US, then, I know Israel is a special case in terms of it's had a blank check for a long time, but it's certainly going to embolden other countries to step over the line. I mean, the line, we don't even know where the line is anymore. So I think that something in sort of geopolitics has fundamentally changed in the last 2 years. And people's eyes have opened and, we could be moving in a very scary direction.
Now, the past 2 years haven't only impacted Gaza, although, of course, they've impacted Gaza more than anywhere else. And Israel's violence hasn't only spilled over into neighboring states in the Middle East. The waves of disorder and illiberalism spreading outwards from that genocidal state have impacted the political fabric of the UK too, as our government has time after time scrambled to protect Israel from scrutiny or consequence for its actions. These have included failing to uphold Britain's obligations under the Genocide Convention. But today, on October 7th, Starmer issued a new warning. Anyone attending anti-genocide protests on October the 7th would be regarded as un-British by the Prime Minister. Women's Minister Bridget Phillipson justified that position on Good Morning Britain.
I share that deep sense of anguish and pain about what we see on our television screens, the appalling suffering that we see, including experienced by children in Gaza, which just reinforces the need to get an end to the war, to get more aid into Gaza as an emergent, with a real sense of urgency. And we all want that to happen, and that's what we as a government are pushing to happen. But today of all days, if we could just pause and reflect about where we are, what happened on October the 7th, and just feel that sense of compassion towards one another.
Is it
that
not
is
possible
not to,
to do the two things at the same time, Minister?
Yeah,
is
it's
it not
to
possible to have compassion for the Jewish community and what they have suffered, and also be entitled to exercise a legitimate and lawful right to protest what Israel is doing in Gaza, the Israeli government? Are you suggesting that protesting against Israel in itself is anti-Semitic?
No, and the right to protest in our country is a fundamental right which we all benefit from, which we hold incredibly dear, and it's a cornerstone of our democracy. But just because you have the right to protest does not mean that you should protest every day, including on days like this.
Now, as we reported yesterday, the government is seeking to introduce new rules to clamp down on what they call repeat protests happening regularly in the same place. And of course, what they mean by that is pro-Palestine protests. But that's really the least of the ways that Britain has tended towards authoritarianism since October the 7th. As I mentioned before, former Home Secretary Yvette Cooper's ban on domestic non-violent direct action group Palestine Action has now led to the arrest of over 2,000 people since July, after perfectly ordinary people began holding up signs in huge numbers reading, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." That last sentence is, of course, illegal in 2025 Britain, expressing as it does support for a group who our government regards as a terrorist organisation. Perhaps because they were successfully driving Israeli weapon companies off this country's shores. Now, Barry, that's just a few examples there of an increase in illiberalism, or sort of collapse of a kind of liberal sense within the, I'm no massive fan of liberalism as a political ideology, but certainly as a social one, I think it's a good idea. We're seeing it sort of really being restricted in ways as a result of Israel's acts in Gaza. Do you think that's going to continue? How far will it go? And how much is Israel and Britain's relationship with Israel responsible for it?
I think you're absolutely right to use the word authoritarianism, but you will see certain people, including political pundits, saying, like, let's not be hysterical. Britain is not lurching towards authoritarianism. I don't know what else you call it. It absolutely is. And it's a direct result of its support for Israel's genocide. And I think we're in a really, really scary place when people's right to protest is being challenged. I know we saw this from the Tory government, but Labour has actually escalated, I think, this assault on people's right to protest. I want to say I was shocked, but I guess, I'm becoming a little bit unshockable when it comes to this. But the way that the horrible attack on the Manchester synagogue was immediately weaponized by bad faith actors, by bad faith sort of Zionist activists, to reframe that conversation in the media to be about pro-Palestine protests. I mean, we call them pro-Palestine protests. They're also anti-genocide protests. And how quickly, as a journalist, I was disturbed to see how quickly the British media allowed them to reframe that discussion. They folded so fast to allowing the discussion to be shifted to one about the protests and not one about what happened in Manchester. It immediately flipped, and the media allowed this bad faith conversation to develop. And ultimately, that led to the Home Secretary introducing this policy about repeated protests. And you're absolutely right. Of course, it's about pro-Palestine protests. That's all it's about. A few weeks ago, we saw 110,000 people march through London in the Tommy Robinson-led rally. I saw footage of people at that protest saying that people arriving across the channel in boats should be shot on the beach, that their bodies should be left on the beach for a warning. There were people who said that Black British people should go home to where, I have no idea. So there were some very, very extreme people, not all of them, but there were some extreme people on that march who were expressing real hatred, and who I think non-white British people are rightly frightened of. And many of my friends were worried about going into central London on that day. So that is a march that can intimidate British people. That is a march that can be labeled a hate march. But that march didn't prompt any of this discussion, and it didn't prompt any changes in government policy, unlike what we've seen in the last week. So I don't know. I think as long as the genocide continues, and as long as this government stays in power with this prime minister and this cabinet, we're going to see similar. I guess the question is how far we slide into authoritarian policy. We don't know. But with the current makeup of the government, I don't see it changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, and of course, when Keir Starmer uses the term un-British to describe those who want to protest on, against genocide on this day, the day that the genocide began, I think he must do that in the full knowledge that he panders to kind of thoughts floating around amongst those protesters that you mentioned there coming to London, the right-wing protesters. You know, that you now can label a large group of people, many of whom are Muslim, as un-British because they care deeply about a genocide, and this further, division that the government is trying to stoke by saying, if you are anti-genocide, it makes you, in some sense, anti-Jewish, without making any sense for the idea that actually you can be deeply, deeply compassionate and deeply, deeply angry at that disgusting, murderous hate crime that took place at a synagogue last week, and also be deeply, deeply disgusted and angry at the disgusting hate crime that is happening in Gaza as we speak. And of course, we saw that hate crime at a mosque last week, at the synagogue last week, but we also saw a firebombing of a mosque over the weekend. And this kind of division is the last thing a government in this situation should be stoking. Thousands upon thousands of young people have taken to the streets in cities across Madagascar to protest against the East African country's president, Andry Rajoelina. The protest movement is led by Madagascar's youth, hence the name Gen Z Mada, and demonstrations have been going on since the 25th of September. Young people are fed up with the cost of living and the daily struggle of repeated water and power cuts from state-run utility company Jirama. The protests have continued apace, encompassing a sense of general dissatisfaction with the government, with corruption, and with incompetent leadership. The Gen Z Mada is inspired by other youth-led protests in Kenya, Nepal, and Peru. In Madagascar, the mainly peaceful protesters have been met with a heavy police response, with cops using tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse crowds. A dusk to dawn curfew was imposed in the capital of Antananarivo. The UN says at least 22 people have been killed and more than 100 people injured in the uprising. But the Malagasy government has dismissed the figures as based on, quote, rumours and misinformation. Last week, President Rajoelina dissolved his government and has now appointed an army general as Madagascar's new prime minister in a bid to end the protests. However, Gen Z Mada rejected General Rufin Fortunat Zafesambo's appointment and gave President Rajoelina 48 hours to resign. In a statement, Gen Z Mada said, as long as Rajoelina remains in power, we will continue the struggle. Barry, we haven't been following this story very closely, and when I saw that you were coming on today, I was like, this is the man to ask about it. What is the background to these protests? What's led up to this, sort of widespread youth uprising?
I've been covering this in my newsletter, Proximities, for the last, I guess it's almost 3 weeks since the protests started. And I'm lucky enough to have worked with a lot of great Malagasy journalists over the years when I was at Reuters. And this has taken me back a long time, but I think it's relevant. Back in 2009, there was a huge political crisis in Madagascar that ultimately led to a coup d'etat. At the time, I was working in Ethiopia and I was a correspondent for Reuters at the African Union. And as this political crisis was developing, a lot of the talks between the two sides took place in the African Union. And so I was able to kind of see these talks up close. And I remember how fraught and how difficult and they were. And, you know, I remember in one case, I was at a press conference with the foreign minister, and there had been some discussion about whether there could be a power sharing government. And I asked him what his reaction to that possibility was. And he started sort of screaming and shouting at me, which was astonishing. But I think I knew at that moment that, or I suspected at that moment, that the government's days might be numbered. But who was the leader of that protest movement? It was the current president, Andry Rajoelina. He led the 2009 protests against the government. And at the time, he was a young man. You know, in many ways, they were youth-led protests. He was a DJ. Then he became a media mogul. I think he owned an advertising company. He eventually became the mayor of the capital, Antananarivo, and then started his protest movement. And a lot of the things that he was complaining about are the same things that the Gen Z protesters are complaining about today. You know, corruption, the economy, poverty, unemployment. I think he was in his early 30s now. And now today, we fast forward, I want to say it's not 17 years, right? I'm dating myself there, but I'm also dating Rajoelina. I think he's 51 now. He's still not that old, which speaks to how young he was when he came to power in 2009. And I think he's been in power for, if my maths is right, about 12 or 13 of the last 17 years. And he is now facing the same thing that he led back in 2009, which I think is really interesting, right? It's like the circle of life. But these Gen Z protesters are very, very dangerous for him. As you say, they've been inspired by Gen Z protests that we've seen in other countries like Kenya, Peru, Nepal. You know, it puts me in mind of sort of the so-called Arab Spring inspiring people in other countries to take to the streets. And why wouldn't they be inspired? Because we've seen great success in those Gen Z protests in other countries. In Nepal, they toppled the government. In Kenya, they sparked real policy change. Go back a little bit further to last year in Bangladesh, where a student-led movement also toppled the government there. So look, you know, this is effective. And I think it is difficult for somebody who's been in power for that long and is presiding over, you know, a tanking economy, unemployment, water shortages, power shortages, to hang on without severely cracking down. And we've seen them start to do that. So yeah, it'd be interesting to watch how it develops. And I think it's a really dangerous moment for this government.
I interviewed two of the protesters who took part in the Nepal revolution, the Gen Z revolution there. And they were very clear that for them, the issue was a limiting of their opportunities by the state as a result of things like corruption and nepotism. Nepotism, I mean, it was it's an amazing kind of social media idea, like Nepo babies. It was a big kind of spur, like showing pictures of like the wealthy children of an entrenched government or entrenched parties, basically, that revolve the government around them. But what you're describing in Madagascar sounds like much more material. Well, I mean, these are material problems, but much more entrenched material problems, water shortages, you know, that kind of thing. Is that a massive difference between the two, or is there something fundamental in common between these two forms of protest?
Well, I think it speaks to how bad things have gotten in Madagascar that you end up with power shortages and with water shortages. And I think what you see, not just with these Gen Z protests recently, but with anti-government protests in general, right, in many parts of the world, is that there is a kind of a spark, right? And I remember like in Uganda years ago, there were persistent anti-government protests, and the spark for that was fuel prices. You know, the spark here is water shortages and power shortages. But what happens then is long-standing grievances become part of the movement. And, you know, Madagascar while it has natural resources, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. It has incredible levels of poverty, and there are people there who are genuinely being really left behind, don't have any opportunities, can't find work. And there is a kind of a sort of a long-standing aspect in Madagascar where there's a divide between the highland population and then the kind of the lowland and coastal populations. So a lot of the political elites are drawn from the highlanders, and then there are other people in other parts of the country who are being left behind. The Gen Z protesters have been very clear that they want this to be a sort of a broad-based movement that brings Malagasy people from all different communities together. But yeah, there is a kind of an entrenched political elite there. And so, yeah, you have a spark, but then you have all of those long-standing grievances that bubble up too. And I actually think, it was similar in Nepal where, didn't it initially start over, a social media ban or something. But I think once it broadens out and once the protesters start calling for the president or the prime minister in any country to step down, then that's when, things really, really heat up. And I think that's already happened in Madagascar.
An aspect of this story that I find, crazy, is the appointment of a general as the prime minister. That looks like the president stuck between a rock and a hard place of an unruly population wanting to bring down the government, or the military, which in general you try to keep far away from political roles. Does this look like a good idea? Am I just imagining this? Is it a bad idea?
I thought that when I saw it too. I thought, oh God, it's so unusual to see somebody say, I'm going to quell protests, or I'm going to satisfy protesters' demands by appointing a general. You would normally think that you would appoint a general to crack down on protests, right? Mm. But there is a little bit of history there that's specific to Madagascar. The military is a powerful political actor. And actually, Rajoelina, when he first came to power in 2009, he came to power with the help of the military. When he was leading his protest movement against the then government and, the whole country effectively ground to a halt, the military finally said, look, if you two, meaning Rajoelina and Mark Ravalomanana, who was the president at the time, if you two can't sort this out, then we're going to intervene. And then what eventually happened was that Ravalomanana, he ceded power to the military. And then effectively, the military then gave that power to Rajoelina. So, Rajoelina was, the military helped to install him in 2009. And so I think having the military on side makes sense to him, and they are important political actors. But when you say he's caught between a rock and a hard place, he really, really is, because he's pulling levers, right? And one of the levers, this first lever that he pulled was, I'm going to dismiss my whole cabinet and I'm going to install a new prime minister. Now, the next lever that he's pulling is we're going to have a national dialogue. And so we're going to bring the student movement together. We're going to bring government together. We're going to bring opposition together. We're going to bring civil society groups together. But what's happened is a lot of the civil society groups in the last day or so have said, no, we're not going to get involved in that national dialogue until you allow the protests to continue, until you stop cracking down on the protests. So it's, do I crack down? Do I have a touchy-feely national dialogue? I think he is caught between a rock and a hard place. And, I actually think that, there are very few cases that I can think of in recent years where anti-government protest movement has got to this stage where a national dialogue has worked to stop the protests. And I think the protesters are demanding a lot more than that. So again, yeah, he is caught between a rock and a hard place. And I don't know how many levers he has left to pull.
Just very briefly then, Barry, where do you see this going?
It's wait and see, right? It's wait and see whether, I think that there are a couple of key things. One is what happens with this national dialogue, and whether civil society organizations do get involved. But again, I'm not holding out much hope that can, that can bring things to a close. I think a more kind of key thing to watch is, will they continue to crack down violently on the protests, or will they allow the protests room to breathe at the same time as trying to engage with the student movement. So again, it's watch what happens with their response to the protests. It's watch what happens with the national dialogue, and it's watch what other levers he may try to pull to stay in power. But right now, I think it's anyone's game.
Does anyone even remember the Conservative Party? They were in government for 14 years. We had 4 Tory prime ministers in a row, but you wouldn't know it from their party conference. Or maybe you would, because the Tories are only reaping what they've sown. Either way, the scenes at conference were pretty bleak. For Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride's flagship speech, the Manchester Central Conference Hall was half empty. You can see all the unoccupied seats down the left-hand side. And Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp's speech didn't fare much better. As you can see, it's hardly rammed. But this post on X from Times political correspondent Max Kendricks really takes the biscuit. He says this: Tory conference feels empty more than anything. The members' debate on free speech has been attended by 55 people. Where are all the free speech warriors, one might ask? Well, they went to Reform Conference instead. Now, even legacy media has picked up on how poorly attended the Tory conference has been. But leader Kemi Badenoch wasn't ready to admit what we can all see with our very own eyes. Here she is on Radio 4's The Today programme.
You saw at Mel Stride's speech yesterday, there were banks of empty seats. People are saying that your leadership, that you're not bringing people with you, you're not enthusing the Conservative Party, that you haven't got the momentum and energy that you need to change things.
Well, that's not true. I looked at how many people were in my speech. It was rammed full. Yes, exactly. So you can't say
the shadow chancellor.
Yes, but you can't say that I'm not enthusing people when it's standing room only. There are queues into many of the fringe events. We have this accusation every other conference.
Let me change the question.
That people haven't turned up to the main. People haven't turned up to the main hall. It's because there's actually quite a lot going on. What is different about this conference is that because we're not
he should be a box office.
What is different about this conference is that because we're not in government, a lot of the people who turn up wanting government favours are not here. They've gone to Labour conference. We used to be teaming with corporate lobbyists. Now we're teaming with party members. So yes, it is different. But let's just remember,
I don't think teaming is. It's not the right word. I haven't seen anything.
Well, you should have been at the pub I was in yesterday. Absolutely rammed full with young Conservatives.
Everyone needing a drink after those boring speeches in those half-empty rooms, I'm sure. Amazing thing to say, though. I'm the leader of, what was once thought of as a natural party of government. And yeah, we no longer enthuse anyone, but at least people turn out to see what gaffes I might make when I'm giving my speech. Badenoch probably didn't have a great time on the morning media round when she wasn't being asked about the wake-like atmosphere at her party's conference. She was being asked about her Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, saying this.
I went to Handsworth in Birmingham the other day to do a video on litter. And it was absolutely appalling. It's as close as I've come to a slum in this country. But the other thing that I noticed there was that it was one of the worst integrated places that I've ever been to. In fact, in the hour and a half that I was filming with news there, I didn't see another white face. And that's not the kind of country I want to live in. I want to live in a country where people are properly integrated. It's not about the colour of your skin or your faith. Of course it isn't. But I want people to be living alongside each other, not parallel lives. That's not the right way we want to live as a country.
Jenrick made these comments about the Handsworth area of Birmingham at the Aldrich Brownhills Conservative Association dinner back in March. The audio recording was leaked to The Guardian and made public today. And his remarks have already been slammed by former Tory West Midlands Mayor Andy Street, who called Handsworth actually a very integrated place. And by the current Labour Mayor Richard Parker, who said Jenrick's comments were racist and questioned whether he should still be able to sit as a Tory MP. In that clip, he does seem to be saying something like, I can't see any white faces here. I don't want to live in a country like this. I want to live in a country more integrated. Like, does he think that integration means that people turn white? It's very unclear what is being said in that. I mean, it's racist, obviously. What people you see on the street at one given moment while you're shooting a video on litter doesn't necessarily indicate anything about the community that lives there. But Kemi Badenoch doesn't seem keen to discipline her one-time leadership rival, who some people think is still gunning for the top Tory job. She said this on BBC Breakfast.
But in and of itself, it's a factual statement. If he said he didn't see another white face, he might have been making an observation. There's nothing wrong with making observations. But what he and I both agree with is that there are not enough people integrating. There are many people who are creating separate communities. I'm very worried
So you agree with
about
him?
what is happening in Birmingham. I'm very worried. Well, I wasn't there, so I can't say how many faces he saw. But the point is that there are many people in our country who are not integrating.
I would sort of really love to know what's meant by integrating here. I'd really like just a definition of, what counts as having integrated. Is it like, a certain number of white people surrounding every residence of non-white people? Is that integration? Is it, what does it mean? What does it mean? How can you tell? It's surely racist, just straightforwardly racist to say, if I can't see a white person around, these people aren't integrated. I mean, integration there just must mean I can't see a white person around. Otherwise, what else could it mean? Without someone telling us what exactly they mean. Integration is not a matter of appearance, right? Integration is a matter of adopting customs, habits, rules, etc., etc. It's crazy stuff. Generic has defended his comments today, saying, we need to have an open and honest conversation about integration, not another one. He also told Sky News this.
And the concern I have in that community and in others across the country, because it's not just about one place, that was an example because I was speaking nearby, is that we're not living in a country which is as well integrated as...
OK, you've used this word integrated as well as the one that I'm interested in.
May I just make this point, if I may? Look, there are real dangers.
Go on.
There are real dangers. If we don't live in a well-integrated community, then this can lead to serious, serious challenges. Look, just the other day here in Manchester, we saw a man who had lived in this country for 30 years, but was clearly not integrated into our society, clearly did not share British values, committing an appalling terrorist attack by going to a synagogue and killing British Jews. That is at the extreme level where failures of integration lead. And that's why we've got to have a debate about this and not have it shut down whenever anyone puts their head above the parapet and talks about it publicly.
Yes, that was Robert Jenrick using his own clearly racist comments about not seeing enough white faces to score a political point about the attack on Heaton Park Synagogue on Yom Kippur, killing one worshipper while another was shot dead by police. Barry, I can't make any sense of why the Tories engage in this kind of racist rhetoric and why they're trying to do a kind of reform. What do you make of it? What do you think they're trying to achieve? And are they going to be successful?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is it's racism. They can go out on morning television and deny it all they want, but it's racism, and it's blunt racism. And, we've seen people for a long time talk about how they walk around London and there are no-go areas and they never see white faces, which we all know is complete absurd nonsense. And now we're seeing it come from a major political party, and we're seeing that party, defend it and call it not racist when we can all see clearly that it is. But I've been kind of fascinated by the Tory Party Conference. And not in a sort of a policy way or a, wow, they're having interesting conversations way, but more in a kind of a Louis Theroux, wow, this is an interesting group of people to observe way. And I think that when you contrast the Tory Party Conference with the Green Party Conference and also the Reform Party Conference, it's really, really stark. And I think that the contrast with the Reform Party Conference speaks to some of these racist statements that we've seen coming from Robert Jenrick and others. Reform at their conference had energy. There was palpable energy there. You could feel it. You could see it. The wind is at their backs. Their tails are up. But, essentially they had one message, which was, an anti-immigration message, which was a stop the boats message, a message that is very, nasty and hateful, but that's very clear. Here is our prospect. Here is what we are offering. I think Jendrick, look, I've said this before. You're not going to out-reform reform. I've said it about Labour too. what Gendrick is never going to out Farage. I see him as a kind of like a blunt force tool who clearly wants to be leader and is kind of scrabbling around for an issue of his own. And again, when you talk about sort of big issues and breaking through to the public, I've talked about the Reform Conference, but look at the Green Conference. Again, just this palpable sense of energy. I mean, much of it from the fact that they have a new leader in Zach Polanski, but you could feel excitement, you could feel buzz. And, then they put out this really excellent party political broadcast yesterday. And again, they had a key proposition for the public, one key proposition. And that proposition was, we're going to tax billionaires. Very, very effective. That's going to break through. What did we see the Tories speaking about the last 2 days? The European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, I know that there's that they're using that as a way to attack immigration, but it's never going to break through. I mean, do you think that you're going to walk down a high street in the UK and you're going to say to somebody, what do you want to see for Britain? What do you want to see change? And somebody is going to say, well, I really want to see us pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And then the other thing that they had today was that they're going to get rid of woke judges, which is just such a Trumpian idea that, again, I don't think is going to break through. I saw a clip from the conference today, or a photo, where they had outfits worn by Margaret Thatcher on sort of headless dummies encased in glass. And it was kind of macabre. And it made me think that there's like a pall of death off the entire conference, and it's the death of a political force. So I think it's a disaster for them, and I don't think this blunt force racism is going to break through either.
I mean, I think they're lunatics, the Tories. I think they're completely insane. They've totally lost it, because there are so many people in this country who are ethnic minorities, who are classic Tory voters, small business owners, entrepreneurs, socially conservative, all waiting there to vote for the Tories, because they're not going to vote for Reform, and they probably won't vote for Labour, but they're there. And so Tories should just be doing social conservatism, none of this race stuff, social conservatism, maybe doing some sort of stuff about, civic values or whatever if they want to, doing a little bit of tax stuff, being good for small businesses, all the stuff that Reform is going to fail to do. There's this spot for them to grow from there, to come back from there if they wanted to. But instead, they're chasing this, as you say, Trumpian, toxic, Reform, antagonistic form of politics. And they're not going to beat Reform. And when Reform gets into power, and when it all goes really, really badly wrong, which I think it will do, which I think, I think it'll be... there'll be a one-term government, if maybe not even a full term. It depends on how things go. But they won't be able to achieve anything of the things that they're promising to achieve, not without radically changing the states in ways that most people won't tolerate. By the time that happens, so when Reform is gone, the Tories will have pegged themselves to that line of politics so much that they'll just look like continuity Reform at the end. So, yeah, no political imagination or creativity or common sense to be found at that Tory party, probably because there was hardly anybody there, to be honest. Now, of course, conference season wouldn't be complete without a roundup of young Tories being young Tories.
Dating as a Tory can be quite hard. What advice would you give to people who just want to pull?
Okay, so I've got a girlfriend now.
Excellent, well done.
When I told her I'm a young Conservative, she won't mention that to her friends at all.
I won't answer that question.
When it comes to being a Conservative online, including on dating apps, be out and proud. Don't be ashamed. Be proud of your views and your values. And if somebody else on one of these apps is so narrow-minded, they don't want to date you because you happen to be a Conservative, that's their loss.
I always say when you scratch a Reform supporter, socialist bleeds. So
we have clear policies to combat Labour. Farage is wishy-washy in terms of whether he sides with them or doesn't.
If you look at some of the policies, they're all about a bigger state. If you want someone who's actually going to take on the madness, it has to be someone like Kemi.
I've got a girlfriend now. Barry, what do you make of the young Tories? I mean, there's a way in which I kind of have to admire their loyalty. I mean, Reform must be really beckoning. You've got to wonder why they're sticking with the Tories, though, especially if they can't get laid. What's your take on them?
I'm glad cringing isn't fatal, or I would be dead in this chair right now. And it's just typical, right? We know exactly what kind of people that we're going to see when we meet young Tories. I was in a pub in central London recently, and a bunch of them came in. I overheard them say that they'd come from a young Tory meeting, and they were sort of very loud, and they were being incredibly rude to the bar staff, and they were sort of guffawing and hooray Henrying, and they were very sort of stereotypical. But and you get the sense that they're drawn to the party for a sort of a tribal reason, and maybe that's why they some of them don't go to Reform. It's like they see the Tories as their tribe, and probably their parents voted for the Tories, and probably their grandparents voted for the Tories. And I actually think there's kind of a serious point there, which is that every time we see these clips of young Tories at conference, we've been seeing them for a long time. We've probably been seeing them for decades, and it's the same person all the time. It's like they come off an assembly line. So, what that says to me is that the Tories are not attracting a more diverse pool of young people. And again, you talk about the lack of energy in the conference. If you're not attracting a more diverse pool of young people to your cause, then you're not really future-proofing, are you?
Not at all. But I am very grateful to the young Tories for appearing at the end of the show, because I think the mood did need a little bit of lightning. Thank you very much, Barry, for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Stephen.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We're going to be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. as always. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.